raise it with members of the technical community and obviously with the authorities, and work out how we're going to untangle it. And because there were so many articles during COVID, the three things you didn't know about and the three things you really need to change, so it was the three issues that we felt needed to be resolved for sea monitoring. And again, I'm referring specifically to emission testing as opposed to the ambient monitoring that Wylie was just referring to. These are the methods that are permitted, and also where the FID can be calibrated against mass standards of the compounds emitted. Again, it implies some sort of foreknowledge and obviously sometimes quite difficult to make up these standards. So actually, although it would seem like a fairly easy method to apply to charge in with an expensive instrument and simply pass the gas through the instrument, in fact, it's a whole lot more complicated. And I find that it's a lot more complicated, particularly when you are trying to explain it to customers who don't have, an appreciation of how the different methods are applied. So something that looks simple on the surface, a total number, very difficult to explain. So just, I wanted to wrap up with a couple of common issues that we see and that I think make it even more difficult to untangle. The first is that there seems to be an understanding that because method 18 is available as a test method, that is simply acceptable to add the masses of material that are measured in the method 18 sample and say that that's the total VOCs. For reasons that I've shown, depending on the column and the trap, you may not see all of the compounds that are present. So you may well underreport the total VOCs using method 18 as a way to measure the total. Obviously, if you know that one of those compounds is the only compound in the stream, then that's a reasonable way to approach it and gives you a good understanding of that particular compound. I talked about the wet basis and the dry basis. It really should be measured on a wet basis, but then we need to also measure the water content if we to go back and report it on a dry basis. I'd argue that, do we really need to know it on a dry basis? Well, our regulations say everything's got to be dry, but for VOCs it probably should be a wet basis as well. And bear in mind that an FID and an NDIR, depending on how you measure it, you really need to keep the water in the sample, keep the water vapor in the sample to make sure the sample integrity is not compromised, because drying the sample will remove the water-soluble components. And then I just wanted to highlight this issue of summing up those totals. If we looked at these compounds and added the specific compounds together, we end up again with very different sets of theoretical results based on how those instruments are going to respond to the different compounds. So just highlighting that. Finally, another great way to change your results, and one that I can't find any guidance on, but basically you'll see a lot of reference in the instruments to calibrating an FID with methane, again bearing in mind that this is a carbon counter. That would be one choice, but EPA does obliquely refer to propane as the required standard. So if you calibrate your FID with methane, you'll end up with, and you put in 1,000 milligrams of propane, bear in mind you're going to end up with a result that says 3,000 milligrams total VOC. If you've calibrated with propane, you're going to end up with 1,000 milligrams. So a very convenient way, if you're so inclined, to reduce your results by a third. And I suppose if you really wanted to, you could keep climbing up the carbon chain. But your calibration standard is obviously critical, and I think that it should be reported as the basis. But there's no guideline in our regulations as to the correct basis for reporting those. So I don't see any resolution on that. So I just have put these out for discussion. I think that if we're going to see consistency in the reporting of VOCs for regulation, I think that the stream characterization should be required, and that sounds easy, but often, particularly if there are variable streams going in, that's often quite a difficult ask. specify the appropriate method for application. In certain situations, for instance, NDIR, probably the cheapest method to apply and still gives you some sort of understanding of the variability of cycles if it's applicable for the compounds that are present. And then also specify the basis for the presentation, wet or dry, calibrated against methane or propane, for instance. On the other hand, I think for engineering there are a number of opportunities with these techniques. For instance, if you're just using it for screening, it should be relatively easy. And if you think that a lot of the techniques that are applied to clean up these streams involve some sort of combustion, an FID might be the ideal way of understanding the total VOCs that are present, because you're going to have to burn that sample anyway. So knowing how much carbon and what your energy load doesn't really matter as much as what's there. But otherwise you would definitely still, for engineering, have to characterize that stream to understand it. And I think choose the method based on the application. For instance, whether there's combustion, again, FID would be a very useful way of measuring it. If it's variable, then you definitely need some sort of online technique like FID or NDIR. And if it's the toxicity that's in question, then you definitely need to use something like method 18 to make sure that you understand all the issues. So I hope I haven't put everyone to sleep with a lack of fires and explosions.
You confuse me even more now.
Well, I'm sorry about that.